Hi, I'm Madeline James, and today we are going to go through my favorite craft books, video series, world building resources, and courses. I'm a fantasy writer and world builder, so I have a lot of favorites that are more geared towards that, but a lot of my craft book and video recommendations are more general writing related as well. And something I think is important to mention is that there is no single right way to write or plot or world build. We all have different goals, different approaches, and different things that are the most important to us. The right way for one person to tell a story could be wrong for someone else. And so when looking for resources like this, different things are going to speak to you. And obviously my recommendations are for what speaks to me. And so my biggest advice is to listen to what really speaks to you, what clicks for your brain, and these are going to be the best resources for you regardless of whether or not I discuss them or whether or not I like them at all. This is also my very first sponsored video, which is fun. I'm so fancy. We will talk about that later though when we get to the courses, but yeah, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I have a Ko-fi linked below if you want to support the channel. But let's get started. We are going to start by talking about craft books. I have read a very large number of books in the last few years, and at a certain point they all start to sound the same. And these are all craft books I have read. Yeah, it's a lot. I wanted to go over my absolute favorites and explain what I like about them and who I think they might be the most useful for. Let's begin with one that I bet everyone has heard of. Save the Cat writes a novel. It's written by Jessica Brody, based on the screenwriting book Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. I'm just going to refer to the novel writing version by Brody as Save the Cat though, just FYI. So Save the Cat is a well-known book on story structure revolving around a beat sheet. It works within the typical 3-act story structure with 15 beats or plot points that weave in character building, world building, tension, plot progression, all of that. And even if you've never read this book, you've probably heard of many of the beats. There's the catalyst, break into two, the fun and games section, the all is lost moment, dark night of the soul, etc. Like any beat sheet or story structure, I don't think you must always follow it religiously, but I think it is a fantastic place to start. And if you were only to read one book on plot and story structure, this is probably the one I would recommend. It shows you a structure that is detailed and specific enough to follow without getting overwhelmed, but it ties in character, motivation, and desire, theme, and so many other important aspects of story. There is also a young adult novel version, which mostly covers the same material, but if you specifically write YA and don't already have the normal Save the Cat writes a novel book, could be a good one to get instead. There's also a fantastic YouTube playlist by Lizelle Sambury, who is a YouTuber that writes YA fantasy, horror, and thriller books where she steps through each beat one at a time and really dives into how she uses them and plots her novel using Save the Cat. I highly recommend it after you finish reading the book yourself. It is also a very helpful series to watch while you are brainstorming new books, just to refresh yourself of the concepts and to kind of get your brain thinking about it more. Next, I have a couple of craft books focusing on the romance novel structure. Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes, and How to Plot and Outline Your Romance Novel Story Structure for Romance Novels and Love Story Blueprints, which is part of the 8 Crafts of Writing. I don't have a physical copy of that, but we're still going to talk about it. But let's start with Romancing the Beat. And this book seems to be extremely popular among romance writers and caters towards both plotters and pantsers. If you write romance, I think this should probably be a must-read for you. It's definitely pretty short and brief, but in combination with another plotting book like Save the Cat or Anatomy of Story, which we'll get to, I think it does the job pretty well. It could also work well on its own if you're more of a pantser and don't want a super rigid structure. I don't personally reference this book when I'm plotting, although I know plenty of writers that do, but it was a really interesting first-time read. How to plot and outline your romance novel is really interesting. It focuses on this core idea that romance differs significantly from other genres, which have stories driven by antagonizing forces. However, in romance novels, there are mostly hinderers instead of true antagonists. And there are a number of different romance structures that are covered in this book, and it talks about the adversity cycle, the temptation cycle, and the story structure. It goes over all the conventions, tropes, and obligatory scenes, and I actually found the way this book talked about romance plotlines really interesting and unique, even though I had read dozens of plot books before I read this one. So this may actually be one of my most recent reads that I'm going to talk about today. Next, we're going to talk about Anatomy of Story and Anatomy of Genre by John Truby, which I don't have physical copies of either. I am pretty sure I do somewhere, but I couldn't find them. But we're going to talk about Anatomy of Story first. And this is probably one of the most popular books on structure, besides maybe Save the Cat, and it has quite the following. It was also intended for writing scripts, which is a trend you will see among a lot of popular writing structure books. They have a lot less word count to work with in scripts, so they have to be very efficient, which works well for us. But back to Truby. His book on how to be a master storyteller is very similar to Save the Cat in that it weaves in all the aspects of story into a plot. It details a 22-step process, which is sort of like 22 beats, really focusing on character development. It is more rigid and complex of a structure than Save the Cat. Definitely a much thicker book. I wish I had a copy to show you. But it's perhaps a bit more difficult to adjust and adapt into new structures. I also found it a slightly less fun read than Save the Cat. And it doesn't work for me quite as well, but that could just be because I read Save the Cat first and a lot of other plot structures before I came to this one. I do think it is probably worth trying both out or watching a high-level review of them both just to see which one you think would work best for you. Or you could just read them both, you know? Now, Anatomy of Genre is really interesting. It's pretty recent. It goes through many types of genre fiction and details the differences between the structures of those genres. So it'll cover important beats and differences of each, how to combine different genres, etc. And so if you write in multiple genres or like to include a lot of different elements, this is definitely a good book, I would say. I do think you should read through Anatomy of Story first because it kind of builds off those concepts. But as a fantasy writer, I didn't find the fantasy genre section super helpful. And I think this is because it's a bit more rigid than I find fantasy to be, which can really cover a lot of different genres too. You tend to have maybe your action and adventure fantasy, your mystery fantasy, romance fantasy, horror fantasy. It combines a lot of genres. So I think it's still a good read, but that part wasn't my absolute favorite. Now we're going to talk about Emotional Damage, and these books are Story Genius by Lisa Cron and The Emotional Wound Thesaurus by Becca Puglisi and Angela Ackerman. Now, I absolutely love Story Genius. By itself, it is a bit too vague for me structure-wise, but as a method for coming up with stories and character arcs, it is unmatched. Story Genius is not a beat sheet or even much of a structure book. It has you figure out the inciting incident or point of no return, the climax, and then sort of just connect the dots. However, it focuses on this idea of brain science and how to create character arcs that really matter. You come up with a theme or a lesson, you come up with a character who needs to learn this lesson, and the misbelief that is holding them back. And then you spend a lot of time in the beginning working on creating this character with a backstory that really establishes this misbelief. It talks about how for your character, at one point this misbelief was true, which I love. So you write these progressive key moments in their backstory that taught them this misbelief where they had to learn this lesson. And then once you have this character with this deeply rooted misbelief, you have to build up to the moment where they have to face their fears, where they have to leave their comfortable space. But unlike other structures I've read, the inciting incident isn't the first push. Their misbelief and fear is already being pushed against before the story even begins, and Story Genius has you build up these ticks, pushing them more and more towards leaving their safe world and starting the journey to face their fears. And it creates this feeling of tension, inevitability, and momentum from the very beginning of the story, which I love it. I can't say that enough. And the rest of this book is great too, but this beginning part I cannot recommend enough. So, on to The Emotional Wound Thesaurus. And this is a whole series of books where it's like a thesaurus for emotional wounds, and there are a lot of other ones. I don't have all of them, but there's a general emotions thesaurus. I have a bunch of ones on conflict thesaurus, all of that, and normally in the beginning they have more of a, how would you describe that? Less of a thesaurus and more of just a guide or a how-to or the craft part, right? And in this book, it has a guide for writing characters with emotional trauma. You create a backstory wound and really delve into the psychology of how that wound impacts the characters, their fears, the lies they tell themselves, their triggers, and the way they deal with this, emotional trauma being triggered, etc. And I think this is definitely a bit darker, but if you want to write damaged characters with tragic backstories, it is absolutely fantastic. Especially if you write adult, I think this is a great follow-up to Story Genius for taking your character development a step further, a step deeper perhaps. And when I was doing my character development for my current book, which is kind of a found family vibe, which if you've seen my character videos where I kind of talk about all the cheat sheets I made and everything, this was really, really integral for me figuring out how I was going to do that, because all of my characters are very damaged. They all interact with each other a lot in different ways, and I didn't want to have POVs of all those characters, but I wanted to really show how their trauma affected them and why they made the choices they made, and then how that growth happens without actually directly explaining it. So all show versus tell. And this book was definitely key in me figuring out how to do that. So now let's talk about Scene and Structure by Jack M. Bickham. And this is the book where scene structure really started to click to me. It's something that I struggled with for a really long time. It talks about scenes and sequels, breaking them even further into their different parts. You have scene goals, conflict, reactions, dilemmas, decisions, etc. And it also talks about some of the more complex scene weaving, like scenes within a scene, transitions, stuff like that. And this isn't a chunky book. It isn't difficult to read. I definitely recommend it, especially if you are struggling to understand how to structure scenes. It serves as a very good starting point for figuring all of that out, the first place to go to learn about scene structure. So the next two books are by Jane K. Clellan, and the first being Mastering Suspense, Structure, and Plot, How to Write Gripping Stories That Keep Readers on the Edge of Their Seats. And now this book focuses on incorporating suspense, which is more critical for certain genres like thrillers and mysteries, but I think it is applicable for all books. It talks about plot moments like twists, reversals, and moments of dangers, but also how to weave in suspense at the line level. My favorite part of this book is where it talks about pacing. Clellan presents this pattern for how often you should have a TRD, or twist, reversal, danger, based off what kind of pacing you want. So if you want a leisurely pace, you need fewer of these, etc. If you know what word count you're aiming for and what pacing you want, you can figure out how many TRDS to plan and how often they should be. I think this is very, very useful for plotters, but could also be useful for pantsers to give you these little signposts to kind of aim for as you're working through your book. But very good. And now, if you're writing pure romance or maybe comedy, this may not be as useful, but something to consider for sure. Now, Clellan's book, Mastering Plot Twists, How to Use Suspense, Targeted Storytelling, Strategies, and Structure to Captivate Your Readers, goes a bit deeper into specifically how to create TRDS, and I think it's a good accompaniment to the first book, but I wouldn't say it's as essential in my opinion. I think if you write thrillers or mysteries or anything with a lot of suspense and tension, definitely read this one too. Otherwise, you could probably skip it if you think the first book provided enough information for you. Now, Robert McKee and his screenwriting books. These are definitely not easy to read and not for beginners. They are not brief. I have found the topics complex, sometimes difficult to work through, and I definitely had to go back and reread a bunch, and there are definitely still concepts that are a bit difficult to wrap my head around. I would say do not attempt these as your first craft books. I think that would be a mistake. It's like if you have a scale of complexity, it would go Save the Cat, Anatomy of Story, and then Story by Robert McKee. If you're not a plotter, this is probably too structured for you, but feel free to prove me wrong. I think as novel writers, we don't have to be as rigid and well-defined as some of the ideas in here, but we can take the concepts and apply them in ways that make the most sense for us as novelists. So, Story is the first book. It talks about story construction, structure, the relationship between character and structure. And despite all my warnings, I absolutely love these books. They are probably my favorite craft books of all time. Story really breaks down structure into a way that absolutely clicks for me. It isn't a beat sheet or a specific structure. It really breaks it down into the components that you can form into a book. So like Story Genius, there's an underlying theme or message, And here it is called the controlling idea, which contrasts the counter idea, which I kind of liken to the MC's misbelief, but it isn't always that simple. And every scene should change the value of the winning idea, creating this increasing tug of war to the very end where one side finally, irrevocably wins. Story also breaks structure down into more levels than most books. You have your story arc, which is the counter idea versus idea. Then you have your act arcs, then your sequence arcs, and then your scene arcs. And then even within a scene, you have the beats. And there is a section on designing each of those, acts, sequences, scenes, etc. And I really like how this is explained, and it made so much sense to me. There is so much other really great content in here too. I particularly like the parts on expectation versus reality, adding subplots or multiplots, crises, contradictions, etc. All great. So, let's see. The other books are character, dialogue, and action. And character is fantastic. I really like the parts that break characters into contradictions and how you weave cast design around it. It has this really cool graphic in it, which I think I have one of these bookmarks in here. Let's see if I can find it. So it has these cast design diagrams, which I can give you a little glimpse of there, but it goes through a lot of different ones. I really like Pride and Prejudice. It's one of those stories that I just really, really love, and I like that they break it through there. Dialogue is also really good, and definitely the most comprehensive breakdown of how to write good dialogue. It's definitely something I still need to work through more. And then the last one is Action, which was co-written with Basim El Wakil, and it focuses on writing action stories. So if you do write action stories or books that just have a lot of action, I definitely recommend it. Now, before we talk about the YouTube channels that I recommend, we are going to talk about some courses, including our sponsor. So this first course is the Reedsy How to Write a Novel course. And this is ran by Tom Bromley, an author and ghostwriter, and it is, unsurprisingly, teaching you how to write a novel. Reedsy is sponsoring this video, but I think we all know how these sponsorships work. My opinions and my recommendations are my own, and they have no influence over what I say, just that I share my thoughts on the course, and I have absolutely zero interest into leading any of you astray. So yeah, I am almost halfway through and it's been going really well so far. I think about the How to Write a Novel course as a college course on novel writing. It costs similarly to a college course. It takes 15 weeks, it has video lectures and exercises, and over the course of the 15 weeks, you write a book from start to finish. So you get daily video lessons, structure to finish your first draft, forums where you can talk to the rest of your cohort, which is other writers taking the course at the same time as you. You get live webinars, accountability, and weekly feedback and critique with other writers if you want. And if you have wanted to do NaNoWriMo, but it is just too much or you feel lost, this could be a really good option for you. You have 15 weeks instead of 4, where you write 1K a day, 5 days a week, to end up with a 75,000 word first draft at the end. And it's definitely more spread out than Nano. You get a lot more support and guidance, and I think it would be a lot easier. Now, I do think this course is most geared towards newer writers who are struggling to actually finish their novel, or writers who really need that structure, or writers who just really learn best in this sort of guided environment. It covers a lot of really important concepts, it gives you examples and options, places to continue your learning, and it just gives you a lot of support. If you are good at self-learning and have already consumed a ton of writing advice, and if you're already able to finish books, this course might not be as helpful for you. I will say though, I have finished multiple books, and you know how many craft books I've read, and I am still enjoying going through the course. A lot of the information isn't new to me, but I like how it's presented, and it is really, really helpful to get your brain thinking about the right things for each stage of the book that you're writing, so having those daily lessons really helps. And there has also been some information that is new to me. I think the first week of the course, I was trying out one of the opening strategies on starting wide and narrowing in, which is something I haven't tried before. And I did it. I ran downstairs to have my husband read the first few pages, telling him it was the most unlike me, but voiciest thing I've ever written, and I loved it. So yeah, even if you're not a beginner novel writer, there's still a lot of value in this course. The next course starts September 2nd. I think a new one starts roughly every 2 months. And I do have an affiliate link that you can use to sign up for the course, which I will put in the description. It doesn't give you a discount, unfortunately, but if you do decide to sign up and you use my link, it helps to support the channel, which would be great. But I will have 2 more videos in the coming weeks that are sponsored, where I will share kind of my weekly updates. I've been blogging, kind of going through the course, and then give my final recommendation. So then we have Robert McKee's seminars or webinars. And we talked about his books, story, character, dialogue, action, etc. And he runs various webinar series for screenwriters, although most are applicable for novel writers as well. He has a few that are run fairly often, like his story seminar, I think is in the fall, it's like 15 parts. Then there's character, etc. And I have heard that these tend to overlap a lot with his books, so if his books work for you, I would save the money and just read those. His webinars are not cheap. If you learn best in a lecture-type atmosphere, maybe consider his webinars. He does have some shorter, cheaper webinars that don't overlap as much with the books. So I think in spring of 2024, he had 4 different, 3-lesson seminars on different genres. So love stories, comedy, horror, etc. And I haven't done any of his webinars yet, but I have been watching his webinar offerings page. And when one of the shorter ones stands out to me, I'm going to give it a go. Now we're going to talk about some of my favorite channels and playlists here on YouTube, which are, of course, wonderfully free. Some of these channels are good for general writing craft advice, but many are really helpful for fantasy writers specifically. To, I am sure, no one's surprised, we are going to start with Brandon Sanderson's Creative Writing Lectures. Sanderson actually teaches this course at BYU, and some years he records the lectures and puts them up on YouTube on his channel. And I think the most recent playlist is from 2020, and I absolutely love this lecture series. He covers a wide range of topics, perhaps a bit more geared towards fantasy writing, but still applicable for everyone. And I think one of the most well-known bits from his lecture series are Sanderson's Laws of Magic. I would definitely recommend this to any writer, but if you write speculative, I would absolutely suggest it go near the tippy top of your list. The next is Abbie Emmons' playlist on how to outline a novel. I have not watched most of her recent content, but these are actually some of the very first videos that I watched on YouTube about writing, starting my love for AuthorTube. And I may have watched this playlist before I read most craft books, but it is definitely where the idea of plotting a character-driven story really clicked for me. And I don't think anything she talks about is groundbreaking, but it is a really concise walkthrough of basic high-level concepts presented in a really easy to understand way. She talks about the lie, the misbelief, the true desire, the need to be happy and fulfilled. I've enjoyed a number of her other videos, so if you like this playlist, I would look around her channel because she has a ton of content. It's a great place to start. And she is a romance writer, so she has a lot of videos on crafting romance specifically as well. So if you're into that, it's there. So the next one is on the On Writing playlist from the Hello Future Me channel. And this is Timothy Hickson's channel, and basically everything he puts out I adore. But his videos on writing and on world building are my favorites. The amount of quality and effort that goes into his videos is honestly astonishing, but he has over 1 million subs for a reason. His stuff is definitely geared a bit more towards speculative writing, I think, but there's a lot of general writing stuff that's really great as well. So on world building, class, wealth, and power, how class systems work, how empires work, magic systems, power escalation, hard versus soft world building, writing mental illness, fight scenes, killing characters, etc. There's just so many amazing videos. I think my favorite videos of his are the ones where he breaks down Avatar: The Last Airbender. So good. He goes through each of the 4 nations and analyzes their world building, and then he also goes through a lot of the major character arcs and such. It is just brilliant. Please watch them immediately. But on writing redemption arcs, where he talks about Zuko, is just chef's kiss. Absolutely love it. And every so often he bundles up his on writing and on world building content, expands it a bit, and puts them out in book form. Right now there is On Writing and World Building Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And his channel is definitely one of my favorites. It's just, everything is just so well thought out. It's so brilliant. So next up is Artifexian, a channel for world builders in general, not specifically writers. This channel is run by Edgar, who is an absolutely fantastic person, and you can just tell how passionate he is about world building and how humble he is, even though he is absolutely brilliant, just from watching his videos. He really loves supporting smaller creators, reaching out to experts when he's out of his comfort zone. He shouts a lot of people out, and he is just a really great member of the world building community. If you are interested in serious world building, his stuff is an absolute must, in my opinion. His current video series is his World Builders log, where he is sharing his process of creating a realistic world, starting from like the star and the planetary system, there's a lot of math, to the plate tectonics, which he models in G-plates, to climate modeling, etc. His last log was on adding rivers, which he used my rivers guide for, which was really cool. But after he finishes up the physical world, I believe he is moving on to conlanging, which is constructed languages, if you aren't familiar. People, speculative bio, which is really cool. Even if you aren't ever going to go into that level of depth, his videos are awesome. And he also has a Patreon, which gives early access to videos and some live streams where he works on his mapping, so you can like draw maps with him. It gives access to his World Building Discord, which is amazing. Lots of really smart people there. And he's doing some videos right now or streams where he's working through this language guide, which has been really fun to just like listen through while you're doing other stuff. So if you like his stuff, I recommend his Patreon. The next channel is Stoneworks, which is another world building channel. And I really like the playlist on civilizations, which covers island civilizations, nomads, deserts, trade, swamps, agriculture, etc. I haven't watched his videos as extensively yet as some of these other recommendations, but there are a lot of gems that I've really enjoyed. The last channel recommendation I have is Atlas Pro, which is not really about writing or world building at all, but if you are a world builder, you will probably really enjoy his channel. He talks about geography, geology, biography, and ecology, often by looking at maps, and there is no better world building inspiration than some of the very weird places in our world. His biogeography videos are so cool, and he has a whole playlist on ice ages, so yeah. His videos are also just amazing production quality. He's another channel with over 1 million subs, so it is very, very good, high quality content. So I recommend checking it out, scrolling through some of his offers. But these are all of my favorite resources that I wanted to recommend. But if there are any that you particularly like, please post them in the comments below so that other viewers and I can check them out too. And if there are any videos you want to suggest, please let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, I would love if you, do all the helpful things, like, comment, subscribe. I have a Ko-fi if you want to support the channel. But yeah, thank you for watching my first, sponsored video. We're so fancy. And I will see you in the next one.